Sometimes the most dangerous mistake a person can make is assuming they already know who someone is. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across Riverside Park, the kind of calm weekday scene that usually passed without anyone remembering it later. Joggers moved steadily along the paved trail, parents watched their kids chase pigeons near the fountain, and a soft breeze rustled through rows of tall oak trees that had stood there longer than anyone walking the paths that day. On a weathered wooden bench facing the small lake, two men sat quietly, looking like they belonged to the ordinary rhythm of the park. Marcus Bennett leaned back slightly, his elbows resting on the bench as he watched the sunlight flicker across the water. Beside him sat Daniel Carter, hands folded loosely, his eyes calmly scanning the area in a way that most people wouldn't even notice. To anyone passing by, they looked like two friends enjoying the warm afternoon. Their clothes were simple, their posture relaxed. Nothing about them suggested urgency, authority, or importance. And that was exactly the point. A few yards away, a teenager rolled past on a skateboard. An older couple walked a golden retriever along the gravel path. Somewhere across the lawn, a street musician strummed a quiet melody on a guitar. The entire park carried the peaceful hum of everyday life. Marcus glanced toward the path leading into the park entrance and checked his watch. 4:22, he said quietly. Daniel nodded once, barely moving. Still early. They didn't speak again for a moment. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was measured, observant, like two people waiting for something most others didn't even know was happening. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and distant food trucks parked along the street outside the park gates. A black SUV sat parked along the curb nearly 80 feet away, partially hidden behind a line of trees. To anyone else, it was just another vehicle blending into city traffic. Neither Marcus nor Daniel looked directly at it. They didn't need to. Then came the sound that subtly changed the atmosphere. The slow roll of tires over gravel. A police cruiser eased into the park entrance and crept along the path meant only for maintenance vehicles. Conversations nearby grew quieter. A few people instinctively glanced over. The cruiser stopped about 20 feet from the bench. For a brief second, everything seemed to pause in that subtle way public spaces sometimes do when authority enters the scene. The driver's door opened. Officer Ryan Walker stepped out, adjusting the brim of his patrol cap as he scanned the area. His eyes landed almost immediately on the two men sitting at the bench. Marcus noticed him without turning his head. Daniel saw the reflection of the cruiser in the lake water. Walker began walking toward them with the confident stride of someone used to being obeyed without question. His boots pressed into the gravel path with steady, deliberate steps. Around them, people pretended not to stare while clearly paying attention. A jogger slowed down slightly. A mother pulled her child closer beside her. Walker stopped just a few feet in front of the bench, his shadow stretching across the ground between them. For a moment he simply looked at them, his expression tight with suspicion. Marcus raised his eyes calmly. Daniel remained seated exactly as he was. The officer folded his arms briefly, studying them like a puzzle he believed he had already solved. "You two mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his tone firm but edged with something colder than routine curiosity. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before answering in a steady voice. Sitting in a public park. Walker's jaw tightened slightly. The breeze moved through the trees again, rustling leaves above their heads as a distant dog barked somewhere across the lawn. What none of the bystanders watching realized in that moment was that the quiet encounter unfolding beside that park bench was about to become something far more complicated than anyone expected. Officer Ryan Walker did not smile. The question he had asked hung in the air for a moment as the quiet rhythm of Riverside Park continued around them. But now that rhythm felt slightly off balance, as if something small had shifted beneath the surface of an otherwise normal afternoon. Marcus Bennett kept his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely on the edge of the bench. Daniel Carter remained beside him, calm and composed, his gaze steady but not confrontational. Walker studied them carefully, his eyes narrowing just enough to show that he had already formed an opinion long before either man answered him. He glanced down at Marcus, then at Daniel, then briefly toward the path. Behind them, as if confirming that no one else was involved. A child's laughter echoed from across the lawn, followed by the flutter of pigeons lifting into the air near the fountain. The sounds of the park were still there, but the tension around the bench had quietly tightened. Walker shifted his weight and placed one hand near his belt in the casual stance of someone used to controlling the situation. "Public park or not," he said slowly, "I have had a few reports today about suspicious activity in this area." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated with a calm tone that carried no challenge. Walker nodded once. "Two individuals matching your description." Daniel finally lifted his eyes directly toward the officer. His voice remained even and controlled. "What description would that be, officer?" The question was simple, but it seemed to irritate Walker more than open defiance would have. He took a step closer to the bench, his shadow falling across the gravel path. Around them, the subtle awareness of nearby people continued to grow. A jogger slowed to tie his shoe, but kept glancing in their direction. Two college students, sitting on the grass nearby, stopped their conversation entirely. Walker folded his arms again and looked down at the two men with a firm expression. "I need both of you to stand up." Marcus and Daniel exchanged a brief glance that lasted less than a second. It was the kind of silent communication that only happened between people who understood each other without needing explanation. Marcus slowly stood, brushing a small amount of dust from his jeans. Daniel stood as well, unhurried, keeping his hands visible at his sides. Walker nodded toward them, as if confirming something in his mind. "Now I need to see some identification." Marcus slipped a hand casually into his jacket pocket, but before he could retrieve anything, Walker raised his hand slightly. "Easy. Slow movements." Marcus stopped immediately and raised both hands slightly in a calm gesture of cooperation. "That is exactly what I am doing," he replied. Walker looked between them again, studying their faces with increasing suspicion. The breeze picked up once more, rippling across the lake and rustling the leaves above them. Nearly 80 feet away, the black sport utility vehicle remained parked quietly along the curb, its tinted windows reflecting sunlight. Daniel noticed it without turning his head. Marcus noticed it without moving his eyes. Neither acknowledged it. Walker circled slightly to the side of the bench, positioning himself so that both men stood directly in front of him. "You two from around here?" he asked. Marcus answered calmly. "We are visiting." Walker raised one eyebrow. "Visiting?" He let the word hang in the air, as if it confirmed his suspicions. "And what exactly brings you to Riverside Park on a Tuesday afternoon?" Daniel answered this time. "Fresh air." The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. A couple walking a dog nearby slowed their pace as they passed, pretending not to notice the conversation while clearly listening to every word. Walker looked from Daniel to Marcus again, his expression growing more certain with each passing second. "I am going to ask you both again," he said, his voice tightening. "Identification." Marcus lowered his hands slowly, moving with deliberate calm, and reached toward his wallet. For a moment the entire scene seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant guitar music had stopped. Walker watched the movement closely, his eyes fixed on Marcus's hands. Marcus pulled out his wallet and held it loosely, not opening it yet. Daniel remained still beside him, his gaze steady and quiet. Walker took another step closer. "Go ahead," he said. Marcus began to open the wallet slowly. None of the bystanders watching could have known that the small leather wallet in Marcus Bennett's hands carried a truth capable of turning the entire moment upside down. Marcus Bennett opened the wallet slowly, the movement calm and deliberate, the way someone might move when every pair of eyes around them seemed to be watching. Officer Ryan Walker leaned forward slightly, his attention locked on Marcus's hands, as if expecting something suspicious to appear. The late afternoon sun reflected softly off the lake behind them, casting ripples of light that danced across the gravel path. Daniel Carter remained still beside Marcus, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. "Reveal a simple identification card." He held it between two fingers and extended it toward Walker. The officer took it and glanced down quickly. His brow tightened. "Marcus Bennett," he read aloud. His voice carried the slight tone of someone trying to confirm a story that did not quite fit what he expected. "From Baltimore, Maryland." Marcus nodded once. "That is correct." Walker studied the card for another second before handing it back. His eyes shifted toward Daniel. "Your turn." Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket with slow and careful movement, exactly the same pace Marcus had used moments earlier. Walker watched closely again, his posture stiff with authority. Daniel retrieved his wallet and opened it calmly, removing a driver license and offering it forward. Walker took the card and read the name. Daniel Carter, he said. Virginia. Daniel simply replied, yes. Walker returned the identification but did not step back. Instead, he looked at both men again, his eyes moving between them with increasing suspicion, as though the information he had just seen had only deepened his curiosity rather than satisfied it. So you two are just visiting the park, he said slowly. Marcus answered evenly. That is what we said. Walker glanced around briefly at the people nearby, who were still pretending not to watch. Then his attention returned to the two men in front of him. Funny thing, he continued. We have had several reports of individuals scouting vehicles in this area over the past week. The words hung in the air. Daniel did not react. Marcus did not move. A breeze swept across the water again, rustling the branches above them. Hesitation. Is there a problem? Walker asked. Marcus answered quietly. No problem at all. He opened the wallet again. But this time he turned it slightly differently. For a fraction of a second something metallic caught the sunlight. Walker noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed as he leaned closer, trying to focus on what he had just seen inside the fold of the wallet. No hint of tension. I was about to show you. He lifted the wallet slightly higher so the officer could see it clearly. The badge rested beside a federal identification card. Suspicious strangers in a city park. Now he was standing in front of two federal agents who had been quietly observing something far larger than a simple afternoon visit to Riverside Park. Officer Ryan Walker stood there for a moment, the quiet weight of realization settling across his face as the late afternoon sunlight reflected off the lake behind Marcus Bennett and Daniel Carter. The park had not changed. Toward the bench, the moment had become one of those quiet scenes that passers-by would later describe with curiosity. Walker rubbed the back of his neck briefly before speaking again. I was responding to a call about suspicious activity, he said. Marcus replied calmly. We understand. Walker looked at both men for another second, as though deciding what to say next. You have to understand how this might look from my side. Daniel nodded slightly. We do. Marcus added. And we appreciate you checking. The response seemed to catch Walker off guard. He had clearly expected confrontation or irritation, not calm acknowledgement. For a moment, none of them spoke. The breeze shifted again and carried the distant sound of traffic from the street beyond the park. Walker glanced toward the sport utility vehicle one more time. This time Marcus noticed the look more directly. He followed Walker's gaze briefly and then looked back at him. You are not interrupting anything critical, Marcus said in a measured tone. But there are reasons we chose this location. Walker nodded slowly, processing the information. The quiet realization continued to settle in that the scene he had entered thinking he understood had far more layers than he had first imagined. Daniel looked toward the far side of the park where the walking path curved behind a row of trees. His eyes followed a man crossing the lawn nearly 50 yards away before returning to the officer. Marcus noticed the subtle glance, but did not react outwardly. Walker followed Daniel's line of sight for a moment, but saw nothing unusual. When he turned back toward the two men, his expression had softened slightly. So what happens now, he asked. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful pause before answering. Now, he said quietly, everyone goes back to what they were doing. Walker studied both agents again, clearly aware now that whatever they were watching in Riverside Park had nothing to do with two men sitting on a bench enjoying the afternoon sun. Officer Ryan Walker remained standing near the bench for a few seconds after Marcus Bennett spoke those quiet words. The park continued moving around them as if nothing unusual had happened at all. A breeze passed over the lake again, rippling the surface of the water and sending small reflections dancing across the gravel path. Somewhere behind them a bicycle bell chimed as a rider moved carefully past a group of pedestrians. Yet the tension of the moment had not fully disappeared. Walker glanced once more toward the black sport utility vehicle parked along the street beyond the park entrance. The vehicle had not moved. Its dark windows reflected the afternoon sun, hiding whatever or whoever might be inside. Marcus noticed the look again, but remained calm. Daniel Carter shifted his attention slowly across the park, his eyes briefly passing over the walking trail, the benches near the fountain, and the row of food trucks visible beyond the iron fence that marked the park boundary. His gaze stopped for a fraction of a second on a man standing near a newspaper vending box about 60 yards away. The man appeared to be checking his phone, leaning casually against the metal box as though he had nowhere urgent to be. Daniel said nothing, but the pause was enough for Marcus to register it. Walker followed Daniel's line of sight once more, trying to determine what had drawn the agent's attention. "Is there something I should be aware of?" the officer asked cautiously. Marcus answered with the same steady tone he had used since the beginning. "Nothing that requires your involvement." Walker nodded slowly, though curiosity still lingered in his expression. "Right." He shifted his stance again, clearly debating whether to remain or return to his cruiser. Daniel spoke then, his voice calm but purposeful. "Officer Walker." The officer looked back at him. "Yes." Daniel gestured gently toward the bench. "It might help if we all look like we are simply enjoying the afternoon." Walker blinked once as he processed the suggestion. Marcus added quietly, "You standing over us draws more attention than you might realize." Walker glanced around the park again. Now that he noticed it, several people were still watching from a distance, pretending not to but clearly curious about the scene. A man with a camera around his neck had paused near the fountain. Two teenagers sitting on the grass had their heads turned fully toward the bench. Walker exhaled softly and gave a short nod. "Understood." He took a step back from the two agents and adjusted his patrol cap. For a moment, it looked as if he might simply walk away. But then Daniel spoke again in the same measured tone. "Actually," he said, "you sitting for a moment might look even more natural." Walker hesitated. The suggestion clearly caught him off guard. Marcus gave a small, reassuring nod toward the empty space at the far end of the bench. Just another man enjoying the park. The officer looked at the bench, then at the path, then briefly toward the sport utility vehicle again. Finally he sat down, leaving a respectful space between himself and the two agents. For the first time since the cruiser had entered the park, the three men appeared to be simply three strangers sharing a bench on a warm afternoon. The breeze moved gently through the trees again. The jogger who had been stretching resumed running along the trail. The college students returned to their conversation. The small audience that had gathered gradually lost interest. Walker rested his hands on his knees and stared ahead at the lake for a moment. After a few seconds he spoke quietly. "So who exactly are we observing?" Marcus watched the man near the newspaper box again before answering. "Someone who does not yet realize he is being watched." Daniel's eyes followed the same direction once more. The man by the newspaper box had just started walking slowly along the path toward the park entrance, completely unaware that three pairs of eyes were now calmly tracking every step he took. Officer Ryan Walker kept his eyes forward as if he were simply another visitor enjoying the peaceful view of the lake, but his attention had shifted completely. The moment Marcus Bennett mentioned that someone in the park did not yet realize he was being watched, the officer felt the subtle weight of the situation change again. The man near the newspaper vending box had begun walking slowly along the paved path toward the park entrance, his posture relaxed, his phone still loosely in his hand. From a distance he looked ordinary. Average height, neutral clothing, nothing that would immediately attract attention in a busy city park. And yet Marcus and Daniel Carter watched him with the quiet focus of people who had been observing him for far longer than the few seconds Walker had just noticed him. The breeze carried the faint scent of food from the trucks parked along the street beyond the iron fence. A family passed behind the bench pushing a stroller, their quiet conversation blending with the distant hum of traffic. To anyone else the afternoon still looked completely normal. Walker spoke quietly without turning his head. "That man near the entrance?" Daniel answered in the same calm tone. "Yes." Walker waited a moment before asking the next question. "What has he done?" Marcus replied slowly. "We are still confirming that." The man continued walking along the path, now about 50 yards away from the bench. He stopped briefly near a park map mounted on a wooden signpost and glanced around as if checking his surroundings. Walker noticed the movement immediately. Marcus and Daniel noticed it as well. Daniel spoke quietly. "He does that every 8 minutes." Walker frowned slightly. "Checks the map." Marcus shook his head faintly. "Checks the people around him." Walker let that sink in. The man stepped away from the map and continued walking toward the park gate. His pace remained casual, but his eyes moved carefully across the area as he passed groups of people. Daniel's voice stayed steady. "He has been here 3 afternoons this week." Walker glanced toward Marcus briefly. "Meeting someone?" Marcus replied, "Possibly." The officer watched the man again. "And today?" Daniel answered. "Today he arrives earlier than usual." The man slowed again near the edge of the walkway, where a row of metal benches faced the street. He paused, pretending to read something on his phone while occasionally glancing toward the sidewalk outside the park fence. Walker leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees as if stretching after a long walk. His eyes followed the man's movement carefully. "You expecting someone else to show up?" Marcus answered quietly. "That is the question." For a few seconds none of them spoke. The man near the gate placed his phone in his pocket and looked down the street. Cars passed by steadily. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalk. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly toward the black sport utility vehicle parked along the curb. Walker noticed the glance, but said nothing. Marcus spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Watch his shoulders." Walker focused more carefully. The man's posture had changed slightly. His shoulders had straightened. His stance had grown more alert, as though he had just noticed something approaching from the street. Daniel's voice remained calm. "Someone is arriving." Walker followed the man's line of sight toward the sidewalk beyond the park entrance. A figure had just turned the corner and was walking toward the gate. From this distance the person was still partially obscured by a row of trees, but the direction was clear. Marcus exhaled softly. "And now we find out who he has been waiting for." Walker sat quietly on the bench between the two agents, suddenly aware that the ordinary afternoon he thought he understood had slowly transformed into something far more complicated than a simple patrol through Riverside Park. The second figure approaching the park entrance moved with a steady, unhurried pace, stepping out from behind the row of trees that lined the sidewalk outside the iron fence. From a distance, the person looked like any other visitor heading into Riverside Park on a warm afternoon. A light jacket, dark jeans, and a messenger bag slung across one shoulder. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would make anyone passing by stop and stare. Yet the moment the figure appeared clearly in view, the man near the gate shifted again. His posture straightened just slightly. His head turned as if confirming what he was seeing. Marcus Bennett noticed the change instantly. Daniel Carter noticed it even sooner. Officer Ryan Walker leaned forward just enough to keep the approaching figure within his peripheral vision while still appearing like a man simply resting on a bench. The park around them continued its gentle rhythm. Children laughed near the fountain. A cyclist rolled past the walking path. The faint hum of city traffic drifted through the open gate. To anyone else the scene looked completely ordinary. But the quiet tension between the three men on the bench had returned. The approaching figure reached the park entrance and stepped through the iron gate. The man who had been waiting near the path took a few steps forward, closing the distance between them. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them waved or called out. Instead, they moved with the careful awareness of people who did not want to draw attention. Marcus spoke quietly without turning his head. "Time check." Daniel glanced briefly at his watch. 4:36. Marcus nodded once. "Right on schedule." Walker watched the two men approach each other. "You have been tracking this meeting?" he asked softly. Daniel answered. "For 3 days." The two figures stopped about 10 feet inside the park entrance. From the bench, they looked like two acquaintances who had simply crossed paths during an afternoon walk. The first man removed his phone again and glanced down at the screen. The second man adjusted the strap of his bag. Their conversation could not be heard from this distance, but their body language revealed something subtle. They stood slightly angled toward the street rather than toward the park itself, keeping their view open to the sidewalk outside the gate. Walker studied them carefully. "They look cautious." Marcus replied quietly. "They are." The breeze shifted again, rustling the leaves overhead and briefly carrying the sound of a passing bus from the street beyond the fence. Daniel's gaze moved toward the black sport utility vehicle parked about 80 feet away. The vehicle remained still, its dark windows reflecting the bright sky. Walker followed Daniel's glance and finally understood. "That vehicle is part of your team." Daniel nodded once without looking directly at him. The two men near the gate moved slightly closer to each other. One of them reached into his messenger bag and removed a small envelope. The movement was quick but deliberate. Marcus noticed it immediately. Daniel noticed it at the exact same moment. Walker leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did he just hand something over?" Marcus replied calmly. "Yes." The envelope passed from one hand to the other in a smooth motion that lasted no more than a second. To anyone walking through the park it might have looked like a simple exchange of notes or directions. But the quiet stillness on the bench told a different story. Daniel spoke softly. "There it is." Marcus watched the two men carefully as they began to separate again, each turning slightly in opposite directions as though their meeting had been nothing more than a casual conversation. Walker felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. Just 15 minutes earlier, he had believed he was questioning two suspicious strangers sitting on a park bench. Now he was sitting between two federal agents, quietly witnessing the moment they had been waiting for all afternoon. The two men, near the park entrance, separated as calmly as they had approached each other. The one who had been waiting near the path slipped the small envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket without breaking stride. The other adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and turned back toward the sidewalk outside the gate, walking with the same casual pace he had entered with. To anyone nearby, it looked like nothing more than two strangers briefly exchanging directions before continuing on their way. The quiet afternoon in Riverside Park resumed its normal rhythm almost instantly. A cyclist rolled past the entrance. A group of teenagers laughed near the basketball court. Somewhere behind the trees, a dog barked once before settling again. But on the bench facing the lake, three men watched carefully. Marcus Bennett kept his eyes forward, though his attention followed the man who had just received the envelope. Daniel Carter did the same, his calm expression revealing nothing to anyone who might glance their way. Officer Ryan Walker felt the strange realization settle deeper in his mind. What he had just witnessed had been almost invisible to everyone else in the park. Yet to the two agents sitting beside him, it had been the exact moment they had been waiting for all afternoon. Walker spoke quietly. "That envelope." Marcus nodded slightly. "That envelope," Daniel added. "It confirms the pattern." The man who had received the envelope continued walking deeper into the park, moving along the curved path that wrapped around the lake. The other man had already stepped back through the iron gate and disappeared into the steady flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk outside. Walker glanced toward the street where the black sport utility vehicle remained parked along the curb. For the first time, he noticed a faint movement behind the tinted windshield, the subtle silhouette of someone inside adjusting their position. Marcus noticed the same thing. Daniel spoke softly. They saw it too. Walker leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as if stretching. "What happens now?" he asked. Marcus took a slow breath, watching the man who now walked along the lake path about 70 yards away. "Now," he said calmly, "we follow the next step." Daniel turned his head slightly toward the parked vehicle. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it was enough. The sport utility vehicle's engine started quietly, blending with the background noise of passing traffic. Walker heard it and understood immediately. "Your team is moving." Daniel nodded once. The man carrying the envelope had stopped briefly near another bench farther along the path, pretending to tie his shoe. From the distance, he looked like any other park visitor pausing during a walk. But Marcus watched closely. "He is checking again," Marcus said quietly. Walker focused carefully. The man glanced across the lake, then toward the fountain, then briefly toward the park entrance behind him. It was the same cautious awareness Daniel had described earlier. After a moment, he stood and resumed walking along the path, heading toward the opposite side of the park. The sport utility vehicle rolled slowly away from the curb and turned down the street, disappearing behind the line of food trucks parked outside the fence. Walker exhaled slowly. "I almost arrested two federal agents 15 minutes ago." Daniel gave a small, calm smile. "Almost." Marcus finally turned his head slightly toward Walker for the first time since the meeting at the gate. "Officer Walker," he said in a steady voice, "today was never about the bench." Walker looked at him. Marcus continued quietly. "Sometimes the most important moments look like nothing at all." Walker sat back against the bench, watching the man in the distance disappear behind a line of trees along the lake path. The park returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the officer now understood something.